Thank you. Well, that was pressure. So hopefully I can, yeah, hopefully I can deliver on that. So the screen being on, obviously my screen is working and my clicker is working. We're all good. So, hey PHP UK, thank you very much for having me today. This is my first time attending and/or speaking at PHP UK. So yeah, thanks. Thank you very much. It's not my thing, but cool, thanks. So, firstly, my name is James. I'm a software engineer at Laravel. When I'm not working at Laravel, I'm working on CheckMango, which is a full-stack A/B testing platform, and also the inspiration for this talk, and we'll get into that a little bit later. When I'm not doing CheckMango, I'm also building Cache, which is a open source status page system that I sold in 2018 and then reacquired August last year, as you do, at a right discount, everybody. Yeah. And then, see, my screen wasn't working. Is that me or you? Them. So, nope. Is this a me problem? Do I need to wiggle the cable or anything? Yes. It's when I have to try and act really cool, like I haven't got shaky hands and I can get USB-C in the right way. Scooch that way. Oh, now my screen's gone black as well. Okay. I played that one smoothly. Okay, we're still working. Okay, so Cache, got that for a deal. And then I also co-organize PHP Stoke. If you are ever in the Stoke-on-Trent area, which is the Midlands, it's not north, do come and say hi. It's a quarterly event. I'm also co-organizer of Laravel Live, which is happening here in London as well in June. And you can find me on Twitter or X or LinkedIn or GitHub or whatever, at jbrooksuk. And because I can, there's my face with the QR code. Please scan that, and it's got all the links. So as I say, PHP Stoke, please, I don't know if there's any familiar faces here. I can't really see anyone. But it's a quarterly meetup we host. It's free. We have two 30-minute talks, two 15-minute talks, and the best bit is there's free pizza, soft drinks, and beers as well, so what's not to love? And then Laravel Live is happening, as I said, in June. It's the UK conference for Laravel. It'd be great if any of you are Laravel developers and haven't been to come along to that as well. So let's get to the real talk. This documenting Laravel APIs. So by show of hands, how many of you are familiar with Laravel? Marcel, put your hand up, thanks. And then how many of you actively use Laravel? Okay, cool. So this is going to be a shorter talk than I was hoping. But no. So let's take a step back from API and just start at documentation, user documentation. Now, we've had the internet for long enough. We're all familiar. Even my grandmother, who doesn't have the internet, knows what an email address is. We're all familiar with email addresses. We can fill forms in. We can click buttons. We know what kind of day-to-day how to move around applications. And often we have the kind of, the words escape me, but we have the like help that users will figure it out themselves. Because we've had the internet and because we've all used Facebook for years, we know how to click into a text area, we know how to type. And that also translates across to phones, games consoles. We're very fortunate in that situation. Oh, cable almost went in my water. This is stressful. All right, I'm going to put that over here. I was worried about knocking it over, and cables are trying to take me out. Okay. So by show of hands, again, because I like audience participation, who has read the Twitter or Facebook documentation? Mm-hmm. Who's read the developer documentation? Yeah, more hands went up than than the other. So we often neglect API documentation, even though we all rely on it. Even if you said you haven't read it. If you've ever integrated with Facebook, you will have had to read the documentation. We often neglect to document our APIs, and that's kind of silly when you think about it, because unlike Facebook, you can click around, or every other application, you can click around and figure it out. With APIs, though, and without documentation, we're left with a few questions because they're not discoverable. So, got those the wrong way around. Without it, we have questions. So, where is this API hosted? Is it on a subdomain? Is it on the root domain and a directory? How is it versioned? Are we using v1? Are we using dates? How do I authenticate it? Is that a bearer token, OAuth, something crazier? What payload do I send? How does that data look? What's the shape of it? Is it GraphQL or JSON or SOAP? And what do errors look like? How do we expect to get an error message back? And also from this, and most importantly, does a 200 status mean an error? I'm pretty sure we've all experienced this now. So, as I mentioned at the start, I'm working on a full-stack A/B testing platform called CheckMango. CheckMango has taken me 3 years on and off, and I still haven't really done a great deal with it, but it's a nice side project to work on. So let's have a... You're in the wrong place. Anyway, I want great API documentation for CheckMango. If we have a look at it, that's what I was expecting. So this is the dashboard. Now, if you're not familiar with A/B testing, essentially you test 2 or more versions of something and compare which one converts better, thus hopefully giving you the better result, and you can switch to using that full time. So in CheckMango we have an experiment, which is a bit hard to see, but an experiment will have 1 or more variants, which are kind of hidden at the bottom. And then when, for instance, if you've got like an add to basket button, and you want to know which button is better, you might have a blue one or a green one or different text on those buttons, you can test them, you can compare them to each other, and then you trigger an event, so basket updated, the one with the most conversions is typically the winner, although not always. We have our events here, different types of events, so we have counts, like add to basket could happen multiple times, but registering a user could only happen really once per user. And then each experiment has participants. You are all participants within an experiment. So, aside from creating an experiment and the variants within the dashboard, everything else is done via the API. You enroll a participant into an experiment, you send the event when they've converted, and so really the API is the product of CheckMango, right? And we know now that without API documentation, no one's going to use it, because how do they even start to integrate with it? So, I went down a journey, and it turns out great API documentation is actually really hard to make. I kind of scoured the internet for a bit, had a look around, thought to myself, well, as a developer, what APIs have I integrated with, and what do I think is the best documentation? And I'm sure most of us have used Stripe, and was that a yay or an A? Yeah, okay. Stripe is held in very high regard for API and their documentation specifically. So this is/was the documentation. It does change frequently. But let's just break this down for a second. So we have additional pages at the top. We have all of our individual endpoints and also some examples of like what a customer object looks like and how that translates into requests. We have different query parameters that we can send through, or payload information that we can send, such as the email and the validation data on there as well. Importantly, the validation. We have descriptions there as well, like metadata is a key value pair. You can click through and see more about kind of metadata objects and what that looks like. You have response samples and example code snippets in various languages, mainly in their SDKs and kind of what like a Python SDK would look like in PHP. And that's quite a lot of work to kind of recreate. And I was like, dude, I'm trying to make an A/B testing platform here. I haven't got time to be making great documentation. Maybe I'll just skip it and then just cry in a corner that I spent 3 years of my life wasting. So how do we solve this? Well, when I picked myself up, I was like, yes, I know, another side project. I'm going to build documentation. And my wife, who has very patiently let me work on this project on an evening while looking after our kids and spending money on it and time. Well, she was like, whoa, 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 whoa. No, no more side projects for you. So I carried on looking, and there is a better way. Some of you may have heard about it. It's called the Open API specification, formerly known as Swagger. Swagger. I did get told off by, I think it was the Open API police. They were like, whoa, James, it's not Swagger anymore. We don't refer to it as Swagger ever, it's Open API. And that's fair, because Open API was renamed from Swagger, but it has since evolved into something a lot different, a lot bigger. But you may know it as Swagger. So in Laravel, there is a package called Scribe, which is a third-party package. There's also a Node.js version of this, which I've not checked out myself. I can't say that it is as good as this. But their tagline, their strapline for this is generate API documentations for humans from your Laravel codebase. Well, that's what I want to do. So the way it works is we take our existing Laravel code, our controllers, we add some attributes and doc blocks. We run it through the Scribe generate command, which pulls all of that out, extracts it into the YAML for OpenAPI, and then puts it into that YAML file, and also, optionally, some actual generated documentation that looks very similar to Stripe's. Okay, show me the code. This is where it gets fun, and hopefully all the bad luck is over now. So, firstly, we need to do a composer require for Knuckles WTF. Yep. /scribe. And then we get to go into the code. So, a bit of a backstory here. I have followed the Laravel bootcamp, which I highly recommend checking out. It's a choose-your-own-adventure where you can learn about Laravel Blade, Laravel Livewire, or just use plain JavaScript. And at the end of following the bootcamp, which teaches you things about routing or routing, models, migrations, controllers, authorization policies, that kind of thing. At the end of that, you're left with something called Chirper. Now Chirper, if you can't guess, is a bit like Twitter. It's a microblogging platform that looks like this. Sweet, thanks Marcel. So, basically, you can just chirp. So, thanks Marcel. What a legend. Okay, that's it. Now, what we're going to do is, I've already built out the API for this platform, but we're going to do everything in the playbook of Twitter and Reddit, and then make an open API. So, let's have a look at that. Oh, let's see that one. I'm going to switch to light mode if that's okay. It's going to blind you, but we're going to be flicking back between the light stuff and the dark stuff, and I think it'll just I'm going to blind you once, get it over and done with. Everyone adjusted? Okay, zoom in. Can you see that at the back? Okay, cool. So, there's two parts that I need to go over before we go any further here. The first is that I have a bash script here called build.sh, just a shell script that runs PHP artisan, migrate fresh, and then scribe generate. For those of you that don't use Laravel, artisan is the CLI tool that we have that lets you run different commands for your application, like making files, generating, like building like compiled, optimized assets, migrating data, that kind of thing. For those of you that do know Laravel and use Artisan, you may notice that we have this env option. So pretty much every command within Artisan will accept this option. And all this does is tell Laravel, hey, instead of using my .env or .env.local by default, I actually want you to read .env.docs. Skip to the right, we have this env.docs file with an app name, app URL, and database connection set to SQLite. Now this is just really for demonstration purposes, but Scribe will generate some HTML for us, and I needed to set that manually and specifically. So that's bonus tip number 1. If I run this, build, let's have a look. Scribe here, let's have a look at the output. So we are dropping all of our tables, we create our migrations, we run our migrations, which just standard Laravel stuff, plus this chirps table. And then Scribe is looking for, through our API routes, it's detected API user, chirps, that kind of thing. And then finally generated a YAML file and also generated some HTML for us. So let's move over to that. Nice. So, all I've done so far, and we'll look at this in a second, but I've added 2 routes to my API, which is API user, and then a resource API for all the chirps. And without really configuring anything, I will be upfront. The biggest configuration change I've made here is to change the theme, because I think Scribe's default theme isn't as nice as this one. That's pretty much the only change I've made, though. So our API endpoints get pulled in here, and we have all of our endpoints documented at a very minimum level here. If we zoom in a little bit. So we have our endpoint, we have the headers that we would need to send for this request, a request sample in Bash and JavaScript, and we can also add languages to that as well, if we choose to, and also a response sample. Let's go down a bit. We have these chirp endpoints now, and it's just saying display a listing of the resource. So it's not super informative, but with a little bit of brain power and a bit of coffee, you can figure out what's happening. The problem starts, though, when we start getting down to store a newly created resource in storage. That's just awful. But also, you don't know any response samples. They're all 401s. So we're going to take this generated documentation, add some attributes, and then hopefully have a much better documentation at the end. So let's just close that for a second. Okay, so in our API routes, I have this middleware with Sanctum. Sanctum is a first-party package that handles authentication, mainly for APIs, but that's what we're using it for here. We have a route that gets our user and just returns request user, and then we have this API resource route for chirps, and that goes to our chirp controller, and that just contains an index, edit, show, delete, casual CRUD stuff. And if you're looking enough, you can say, see, display a listing of the resource. So Scribe has already pulled out the doc blocks and used that for the documentation. So we're going to extend this and start changing it, and we'll start with this user endpoint. Thanks, Copilot. That's not useful. Get user, and we'll add a group for this called users. Just, that's all we need to add for there. And the other way we can do this is to, the other thing that we don't explain here is we talk about authenticating requests and that you need to use a bearer token, which is what Sanctum is providing for us. But we don't actually tell you which routes require authentication. So we'll add that as well. So group users, and we'll say authenticated. So we're using dot block annotations, I think they're called. Yeah. Thanks, Marcel. To tell Scribe that how we want to group those endpoints and also that they're authenticated. The other way we can do this, though, is with PHP attributes, which are my preferred way of doing this because, one, the IDE will be able to auto-complete it, and also it has saved my bacon a few times, especially given this talk, when I forget how to do something, and it will fix it for me. So I'll say that it's authenticated, and that imports the Knuckle Scribe attributes authenticated, and we'll also add a group, which I need to also import, and we'll call that chirps. We could also add a bit of a description, chirps API, sweet. So now we'll change these descriptions here, list chirps, get chirp. Yeah, this is the most tedious part, to be honest. Edit chirp and delete chirp. Okay, if we rerun our build script and go back to Scribe here, on the left-hand side, it's now grouped our endpoints. We have a chirps endpoint and a chirps endpoint and a chirps group and a users group, and they're now grouped together nicely. We also require authentication, and we have descriptions about what each endpoint does: list chirps, create chirp. And obviously, you're free to describe those routes as you please. Personally, I prefer the shorthand: list, create, get, edit, and delete. But you're free to do as you please. Okay, so let's start at list chirps. So, a couple of things here. This endpoint is not documented at all, really. There are no response samples that explain what the data looks like that you get back. And also, if we have a look back in our endpoint, let's go up to the top. Here, we're actually using the request to be able to filter and paginate the chirps that we get back. So, we have this chirp model, which is like active record. We're saying we're going to create a new query. We're going to eager load the user that created the chirp. And then when the request has a user ID, we want to filter down by the user. And when the request has a search, we want to filter the messages by that search parameter. And then finally, we're going to paginate with a default of 25. Now, all of that logic is hidden to the developer that is integrating into this platform. So we can add some things here to tell Scribe more about it and provide that information to the developers. So, again, there's a couple of ways that we can do this. We could do API resource and, we then return a chirp resource, which is just basically a representation for an API about how we're going to return this data. In this case, we're just saying, here's the ID, here's a user object, just the ID and name, the message, and the timestamps. And within Laravel, these resources can either return a single object or a collection. And we can also tell Scribe, this endpoint returns a collection. So the two ways we could use API resource and say, hey, that's nifty. API resource and API resource model that we return a chirp, or we can use annotations. Response from API resource, chirp resource, chirp model, nope, class, and collection true. So that will, if we run this now, we now have this response sample with some kind of fake data in there. So if you're not familiar with Laravel at all, you might not realize how this works. It's quite clever. In our chirp model, we have a factory, and this factory is basically just a way to fake out data. And it's mostly used for testing. You wouldn't want to really go around in production creating factory users. That's crazy talk. But it is useful in testing and also in Scribe. So what we do is create a new user that gets applied to this chirp and also fake the message with a couple of sentences. And then you end up with this data attribute and example response, with the data, and then some fake data in there, which is really neat. So we're just going to add this to our other endpoints quickly. Now, every other endpoint just returns a single chirp resource, so it's no longer a collection. Oops. And for edit. Now, destroy, when you delete a chirp, when you delete it, there isn't a chirp to return anymore, so we return a no content, which is the 204, which is something different. So we'll come back to that a bit later. Okay, so to add our query parameters here, we can just add a query parameter attribute. Oh, it's saving me so much time. What a pain. A user ID, integer, description, filter chirps by user ID, and we also need to say that it is not required because that is the default. We'll do the same for, yeah, thanks. And per page. So the way that Laravel's pagination works is that you can supply a number to paginate by. In this case, we're just asking for a per page query parameter. And then kind of within that pagination as well, Laravel will be looking for a page parameter, and we can tell it what page of those results to return. So we will basically add another query parameter. Let's see if it gets this one. Amazing. Okay. If we run this now, we have all of our query parameters documented. So we have user ID, integer, filter chirps by user ID, and it also contains some examples. We can also change the examples. So maybe in the search we want to, example, PHP UK, and then we have a better example. So you can let it just fake what it thinks is a string, or you can provide more detailed examples, which is probably more useful than like, is that a constant? Am I supposed to do something with that? Is it a magic code that unlocks crypto or something? Yeah, so we've added a few attributes here, and we've already got far better documentation across all of our API. If we move to create now, it's already pulled out this body parameter of message. So why has it done that, but it wasn't able to get query parameters? Well, that's a very good question. In our store method, for creating a chirp, we have this store chirp request. Now in Laravel, there is a concept of form requests, and a form request allows you to add validation and authorization to your different endpoints. And these also allow you to kind of use them around, like share the code between maybe the API and the front end. It's just a very nice way of abstracting that all there. So Scribe has pulled out this store chirp request form request, looked through the rules, found the message, and has found that it is required. It needs to be a string, and it needs to be a maximum of 255 characters. And then with that, Scribe has already pulled out this message here. However, this time, the example is still not, whoa, I should have done this, yeah. It's given us the same terrible example, so let's add that. Now, in form request, it's a little bit different. We add this body parameters method, which just returns an array. Come on, Copilot. There we go. So the message of the chirp with a bit of a description, and then maybe hello PHP UK. It's a pretty good job. If we build that, we have our example, and now we have the message of the chirp followed by our validation rules in like a human-readable way, and it has also put that it's required. And of course, because we copied over the response from API resource earlier, we already have the response sample there as well. How cool is that? Like, it's already pulled out for most of it. We just needed to tell it what our data looks like. And in fairness to Scribe, it'd be very difficult to understand what's happening at the end of the method there as well. Okay. For get, that's pretty much all the same as well. We just need to return a response sample. It requires authentication to fetch them. And then with edit, this is similar to store, but yet this time it hasn't pulled out the form request and knows about the message. Well, that is because we don't use form requests in our update method. We just have a normal request instance, and we can just update the chirp, which is terrible. Don't do this in real life. But when I found that Scribe could do this, I was pretty mind blown. You can do inline validation within your controller methods. Stop being so good. 255, so it matches. So let's say some of your endpoints are using form requests. Perfect, that's a really good way of doing it. But some of it might be inline still. Well, if you have inline validation, request validate, then Scribe will pull that out as well. Message must not be greater than 255 characters, which, so cool. But the example is also, in this case, just a random string again, so we can change that. This time we'll use just a comment. Example, PHP UK is awesome. Copilot is stealing my time. There we go. It's just read the comment above the field that we're supplying, and it's put that as an example as well. And it, of course, again knows that it's required and the length of the string through those rules. And then finally, in terms of kind of what these results are looking like, we have this delete endpoint, which is just unauthenticated. It's not useful. Do you get a success, like 200? Do you get a 204? Well, in our case, we give a no content, which is a 204. So we should inform the user. We should inform the developer of that. So there's a couple of ways we can do this. We can just say response as another attribute. It's a 204 description, chirp, deleted successfully. I feel like that's going to break. Oh, cool. Yeah. Status 204. Yeah, there we go. So when you delete a chirp, you get a 204. That's it. Endpoint is finished. We have an empty response. There is nothing there. And that's kind of it in terms of like baseline developer documentation. So now, without a great deal of work, we've documented our body parameters, we have example responses, we have chirps and users, but we can take it further. So let's have a look. Previously, we had these 401 unauthorized or unauthenticated response samples, but now if we drop down our response sample, we just have 200. So we only have the happy path for our endpoints. But of course, development isn't all happy. So we can do response, we could say, pass it a status. Oh, amazing. We could do a content as well. And maybe we stop it. It's too good. Let's say it looks like that. Now we've applied this to our controller level, which will apply to all of the routes and endpoints within that. So now we have a response sample of 200, but we also have a new option, 401 unauthenticated, and we have the example response there, and that's applied to every single endpoint, except for the user, because that is still 401. Now this is a slightly different example because we haven't actually created a resource here. Potentially you might have older endpoints that don't use API resources and don't look the same as your like standard controller, your newer methods using newer Laravel features. So there are a few ways we can address those as well. And that is by using files. So it's a bit small to see, sorry. Within my resources directory, which is typically reserved for front-end assets, views, like Blade, Laravel Blade, JavaScript, and CSS, I create an API responses directory in there with a 401. And what does a 401 look like? Well, it's this JSON, store that in there, and the same for a 422. So one of the example responses that we're currently missing is validation. This is really in my way. So we should really explain what that looks like as well. So to do that, we will use another attribute on our store and update methods. Response from file this time. Oh, need to import that. Resources, API responses, 422.json, 422, and we'll give it yep, cool. I'd be really stubborn if I just kept ignoring Copilot and not accepting its examples. Oh, I should have applied that to the edit endpoint. Okay, so let's go back to chirps and create response sample. This time we have 401. We have 200, 401, and now 422. Now that is also a documented kind of response as well. So in our API, we could also do this using inline, yeah, just like that. Thanks. What doesn't Copilot know, hey? Users get user. Oh, I put that. Ah, it tricked me. let's say, I don't know, ID1, name, James Brooks, blah, 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 blah. Okay, now we have a response sample of 200 as well. And of course, we could use response from file in the exact same way. I just don't think attributes are supported within functions themselves, so it can't be applied here. So why would you want to use files? Well, there's a couple of reasons. What I personally like to do is keep my continuous integration to run my tests, and also have a test that kind of gives me the output of failed instances. So I want to hit my API as an unauthenticated user once, and then I want to store that output in a 401.json file. And then if I ever change those authentication errors, then all of my endpoints are now updated with the same response. So you've got the consistency. And also, developers reading that for the integration, well, that's why is it different here than it is here? Well, no, it's not. It's all the same. Okay. That's that and that and that. So the other thing with Scribe, of course, is that it will generate our OpenAPI specification file, which is just a big YAML file. And you can import that into tools like Postman or Insomnia and have all of your, like a playground of your API where you can go and make test requests, and also have all of the same kind of documentation within those tools as well, which is just incredibly powerful. Okay, where are we at? I feel like there's one more thing. No, okay. Oh, there was. So the Scribe configuration file is humongous. It's probably one of the biggest. So here I've changed the theme. I think you can leave that empty and it will use the default theme. And then everything else can get filled by configuration files or, environment variables or other configurations. We can add descriptions, change the base URL. We can ignore routes. If we didn't want private API routes to be documented, we could just tell them to skip that. Maybe you have, where is it? There's an exclude here. So maybe we have admin API routes, or we could just turn that off. Maybe we get rid of our user route here. Maybe that's an internal API. I don't know what I did there. That'll be fun later. Oh. Don't let me down. Maybe it's user. Hey, come on. Play nice. Exclude these routes. Yeah. Well, I don't know what I'm doing wrong, guys, but you can exclude routes. Also, all the headers that are defaulted here, authorization, content type, and accept, you can also add or change them as well. So maybe you're using like JSON API where they have a slightly different JSON header, or some other funky header that you want to use there as well. There's so many configuration parameters. You can alias things. You can do like a try it out feature. So let's say you're doing like an IP lookup endpoint or something. You could have Scribe actually send a request to your endpoint and either give it like dummy data back or real actual data from your application. And you can do all rate limiting in there. And one thing that I wanted to add here, if I can find it, try out auth intro example languages here. So of course we need to add PHP. And now we have PHP with like a basic rudimentary guzzle client, and actually how to make API requests in PHP. And let's say you have a PHP SDK and you actually want to push that as the sample code. Well, you can modify these as well and add your own languages if they're not already like automatically provided, which is very powerful and very useful. If you have an SDK, here's a really good place to demonstrate that. And you can also add kind of additional information here as well. which I also forgot to mention. So let's say in our list chirps, we want to mention that this particular endpoint is rate limited for some reason or another. If we go back to our chirp controller quickly, and we go to our list chirps, we can add some more information here, like get a list of chirps ordered by latest chirp first, rate limited to 60 requests per minute, sure. If we build our application again, we now have some extended information about that endpoint. So we're not limited to just the name. The name can still remain short. Sorry, I forgot to mention that earlier. Okay. So what do we learn? Well, we can generate documentation directly from our code. It's super quick. It's just part of the development pattern, or process rather. The documentation now stays in sync with our code. It does help if you use Laravel's kind of standards, or Scribe standards as well in some cases. But now, if you change your form request, your validation will update. If you change your API response or API resource, the sample responses will update. We can automatically provide those downloadable specification files. It's almost too easy now. We don't really have an excuse. And all we've added is more code. And what developer doesn't like more code? So what else can we do? Well, we can write our own strategies. So for a strategy in Scribe is the individual process of pulling out or extracting information from our code and then turning it into that YAML or additional data for our output, our HTML output. And we can also make use of OpenAPI's extensions format, so we can add additional data. So for instance, in CheckMango, I wanted to add some additional pages to my output, and there's like an X page extension or something. We can enable the try it out feature. We can do custom themes. So maybe you don't like the default theme or the elements theme that I used. Well, customize it yourself. Fit the branding with yours, with your company. And like so much more, that configuration file was massive. We barely touched the surface of it. How do you host your documentation? Well, you can use Scribe's generated documentation, as we were doing. All that's doing is building a docs directory into our public folder. It's just static HTML. That can be served very quickly. I mean, I think that's pretty good, to be honest. I don't think it's really missing that much, really, especially when you add custom branding to it. I think it's really good. Or you could use something like bump.sh, which I'm not affiliated with. I do use bump myself for CheckMango. And this is a bit closer to Stripe's API documentation, where you have these additional content pages. So I'm talking about rate limits, how to generate a token. The actual user documentation for CheckMango is linked there as well. We have the individual endpoints. We have the different request types, so you can see quickly create an event as post. We have the additional payloads and, not additional payloads, we have the payload information and what that structure looks like, as we did in Scribe. The headers, of course, sample responses, which in Bump are just kind of layered on top of each other. You don't have a switcheroo. Example code snippets, you can download the specification files in both YAML and JSON. And also in Bump, they have a changelog feature. So every time you update your API, which you can do using like GitHub Actions and just send your YAML file as part of the continuous integration process. Excuse me. Bump will look at the differences and tell you whether it's a breaking change, whether you've added or removed an endpoint, whether you've changed the sample responses. So developers can look at that and say, well, my API was working, my integration was working yesterday, what's changed? Well, the changelog will tell you. You also can't hide anything, it won't let you delete it. So it can't be sneaky. And if you want something open source, Scalar.com is a relatively new service. They have a lot of open source offerings and packages and like elements integration. And that's it. Thank you, London.
Wow, That's really cool. I like that. Are there any questions? There we go.
If this is why Laravel?
No. So instead of generating static HTML, can you also bundle it into the Laravel app so that instead of showing just a placeholder for your API token here, that it gets personalized? So when I'm logged in, then I see my actual token.
Not by default, because it does just generate the static HTML. I think you could probably write, if your documentation was behind a middleware where you had to be authenticated and you could get the active user somehow, you probably could use Blade to fetch that in some way. I don't know if it'd be possible to do that there, because I'm pretty sure it's static HTML.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. By the way, Scribe was forked from Marcel's own package, Swagger, Laravel Swagger, I think it was, something like that, years ago. So thank you to Marcel for doing that as well.
Hi, thank you for the talk. How does Scribe hold up to, so we have like a 300 endpoint API at this point. Can you do the inverse of exclude everything but only include a small subset of endpoints? And then also, how does it hold up when you're not using Eloquent? You just opted for the query builder.
If you're not using Elegant and you're just using the query builder, you would have to use like the file way of doing it. You'd have to generate something that way really and do it. I'm pretty sure, so I'm not the author of Scribe, unfortunately I just really like it, but I'm pretty sure it's using like Laravel's standardized way of dealing with that kind of thing. So you would need to have something that generates those examples for you somewhere. And for the includes, yes, so I'm gonna put my drink down. Include. Yeah, so you can say to only include routes that are maybe API/v1 or something like that, or maybe external or whatever it is, rather than like a catch-all, or you could catch everything and then exclude. It just depends what's the easiest way for you to match those endpoints, really.
Anyone else? Then I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
You generate static HTML. Have you ever tried to validate it?
Have I ever tried what, sorry?
To validate it to W3C standards.
Good question. No, and to be honest, it probably isn't. But you could definitely make your own theme that is valid HTML, like W3C valid. But I'm not sure the default is. Is there a way we can validate that online? Yeah. Is it like a URL?
For validator.w3.org, and you just dump the URL in it.
Who fancies trying it? Yeah!
There we go.
Cool, so we're gonna expose, which is also built by Marcel. Let's just call it Chirper. Docs. Text.html. Yeah, so far so good. Right, W3C valid. Oh my days. Validator.w3.org. Okay. Oh, we're living on the edge. Let's see what it does. We're human, all right.
Here comes the truth.
It doesn't look that bad, to be honest. Some meta tag. Div is not allowed to be a child element of a button. Yeah, that's fair. End tag for body is seen, but there were no closed elements. Oh, there were unclosed elements. I mean, that's not bad going though, is it?
Wow. I mean, if you like cross-site scripting, so, well, some people use nowadays the validator to find really errors.
Yeah. I mean, these all look, famous last words, these all look very easy
It's not that long,
to
the
fix.
document.
No,
So
14 errors.
yeah, that's good.
Yeah?
All right, any last questions? Yeah, there we go.
Thanks, James. Does Bump support the demo code, like where it will actually let you send a request to your API endpoint?
Does it what, sorry?
Does it support letting you send demo requests from the documentation?
Yes, so you can enable the try it out feature. Keep this way away from those cables. In the configuration file, so there is a try it out section. We can enable that. And you could have a different endpoint for just the try it out endpoint, so like a demo, which has maybe got different rate limiting rules. I don't know if this will even, let me try it. You know what, I've never actually tried the try it out feature, so who knows. Yeah, nah, we're already living on the edge, hey? Yeah. Here we go. So it already wants us to supply our own token, so we could do that. I'm pretty sure there is a way to like avoid the whole token and just let it send a test. But we have these, I don't know, invalid URL.
But
you
Bump won't be able to run that code, like it's not having your PHP code on Bump's service. So you'd still have to host.
Sorry, on Bump. No,
Yeah.
Bump doesn't have the try it out feature, I don't think. For my own API on Checkmango, that doesn't really make sense because it's very contextual to your own application. But I guess if it did, you would configure the endpoint that you wanted it to work on, and it would just hit your own API. But I'm not sure if that's a thing with Bump, actually.
Cool.
Sorry.
You
I don't know
have
why
to
I'm saying sorry, it's not
apologise.
mine.
Thanks.
Yes, we have another question from the Slack channel from Lucas. Can I add those additional content pages in MD format?
MD format, Markdown. Good question. So, in my own project, I have this configuration right at the end of Scribe where you can add, I'm not even sure if it's in the default configuration file actually, but there is like a order overrides, open it, yeah. Within the Open API section of the configuration, you can do like X, come on Copilot, help me out. No. I think it's X pages or something like that. And you can just supply an array of text. So in theory, you could. I don't know if it would allow you to or not. That's a really good question. I'll have to try it on my own application, and then whoever that was that asked the question can find me, and we'll have a look. Yeah?
Right, I believe that's it then.
Sorry.
Thank you so much, James. Give him another round of applause. Thank you.